Okay, so this session is going to be about improvement initiatives or change programs, which is basically a fancy way of saying about any new thing that we introduce for our teams or for our organizations, be it a new method, be it a set of new practices, be it a different way of working. And it is kind of aligned with what Stephen was talking about during his opening keynote, because he spent a lot of time talking about how practices don't cover this gap in performance and how we need more. And I want to use examples from our context, from the context of software development, from the context of knowledge work, to give you some stories, some examples why it doesn't really work. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Pawel. I run Lunar Logic. Lunar Logic is a web software shop here in Krakow. I also coach and train teams, helping them to get better. And I would do that on different levels. So sometimes I would work on a team level, helping, for example, with introducing Kanban. Sometimes I would work throughout the whole organization, helping them to roll out the big change program. I also run a blog called Software Project Management. And typically, if you are interested in whatever I'm talking about, on the blog there would be kind of more extensive version, except it's written, not spoken. So I strongly encourage you to visit the blog. And finally, sorry, the party yesterday was like super loud. You've had to yell for someone to hear you. So my voice isn't in the best shape today. So finally, you can find me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is Pawel Brodzinski. So the title of this session is like this, not without a reason. I mean, when I'm thinking about improvement initiatives or change programs, they are like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it, but nobody really knows how to do it. But since everyone else is saying that they are doing it too, we are saying that we are doing it too. I mean, when you think about it, it cannot yield good results, can it? I mean, we are just trying to figure out how to do it. And when you look at the numbers, at the actual numbers, how successful you are with our change programs, well, those numbers are pretty sad. This is John Kohler in 1995, who, basing on his research, who said that 70% of change programs fail. It's kind of an old number, isn't it? It's almost 20 year old. And in fact, back then, it was no new news. It wasn't a surprise. So let's look at the research that is closer to our times. 2008, McKinsey. Surprise, surprise, 70% of change initiatives fail. So let's look for a different part of the world, not US, Australia, Bain & Company. Same year, 2008. They're even more pessimistic. 70 to 90% change initiatives fail. Ron Ashkenaz, in his Harvard Business Review article last year, summarized it all that for more than 40 years already, the numbers in terms of how good we are at changing our organizations are steady. And those numbers are pretty appalling. Now, the interesting and pretty sad thing in our context is that what we've seen over the course of the last 10 or a dozen years is a huge rise of Agile, huge rise of Lean. Agile is basically a mainstream by now. Lean is getting more and more ground. Now, both approaches, if we can call them approaches, aim to help how we work, aim to improve how we work. In fact, Lean in its soul is a tool to put us on a path of continuous improvement. Now, with those approaches getting more and more popularity, we would expect that we would see some impacts on the bottom line on those numbers, and we don't. So the interesting question would be, why? What we are doing wrong? I mean, with all those cool, trendy, agile, and lean stuff, what we are doing wrong that we are not improving, that there is no impact on the bottom line? So my answer to that would be the way we approach adoption of Agile and adoption of Lean. So it's not without a reason that Agile or Lean got successful in the first place. So we've seen those success stories, those experience reports that, we've seen Toyota that got to the #1 automotive company in the world. And this is a home for Lean. We've seen the early successes of agile companies in software industry. So we started thinking, well, if they can do it, we probably can do it too. So we started looking at what they are doing and started copying it. In fact, there is a very nice story about managers from American automotive industry. In early 90s, they realized how badly Toyota was kicking their butts. So what they did, they went for a trip to Japan to see what Toyota is doing differently. And Japanese were very open. They showed them like everything. They showed them factories, they showed them production lines, they shared all the practices. So Americans were pretty surprised that, you know, Japanese are so transparent, so open. Nevertheless, they noted all the stuff that was happening there. They brought it back home, implemented that in their factories, and interestingly enough, in quite a few cases, they made the situation only worse. Because what they didn't realize, and what Japanese knew, was that copying practices is not nearly enough to copy success. In fact, when we are talking about Toyota production system, which is the root of lean, it took Toyota like 20 years to put the whole culture, everything in place. So copying practices that you can do over the course of probably a few months is not nearly enough. And this is exactly what we are doing in our community. We are taking practices or methods like Scrum here, Kanban there. We are copying that, and then surprise, surprise, nothing changed. So whenever I'm thinking about the context of changing our organizations in a sustainable way, I see an iceberg. I see an iceberg, and as with an iceberg, there is this small part that is afloat. And these are practices. This is what we see. This is the stuff that we do that can be noted and copied. But below the waterline, there is stuff that is important. There are principles. There are principles that made those practices work in the first place. And then, even deeper beyond the principles, there are values. There are values that people in a specific organization care about, that made those principles emerge, that made those practices work. So if we don't pay attention to the whole iceberg, well, we may crash as one of pretty well-known ship. Now, the interesting thing is that similarly to the real icebergs, the part that we see is like 10%. 90% of an iceberg is under the water line. So if we don't pay attention to those two, we will just support the sad part of the statistics about change programs. So anyone knows that? What that is? Seems familiar? It's Scrum development process, right? It's one part of Scrum. So it kind of works. I mean, there are people who claim, thought leaders, who claim that if you apply Scrum, you will see at least 200% improvement in productivity guaranteed. I've heard 200. Maybe it's 600. They do guarantee you that. Now, so let's think about that part of Scrum. This is like why it is here. I mean, there is a principle behind that, and it's kind of repeatable, predictable delivery, right? We have iterations. At the end of every iteration, we would deliver something. So let me give you an example. Anyone knows this company? Or anyone didn't buy anything ever from them? So, do you know how frequently Amazon deploys their software to production?
Every 10 seconds.
A few thousand times a day. Every 11 something seconds. Anyway, just imagine. So it's like a few thousand times a day. Delivery. Now, imagine what would happen if Amazon implemented Scrum by the book. With iterations, let's be optimistic. Let's assume that the iteration length would be a week. They wouldn't be able to respond to change. They would run out of business, basically. Now, because the principle behind how they work is not a predictable bi-weekly delivery. It's like getting to production as soon as possible. It's kind of different. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm bashing Scrum, even if I do. So here's an example that is closer to my heart. It's visualization, one of pillars of Kanban. So whenever we are starting introducing Kanban, we would start with visualization. Visualization is this tool that allows to harvest low-hanging fruits. This is kind of quick win whenever we are starting with Kanban. So we would universally start with that. Now, anyone knows this company? I know we are in Poland. eBay didn't win the market in Poland, but still, we probably know that company. So one of eBay daughter companies operating in Europe, there is a nice story. They were rolling out Kanban across multiple teams. Now, in one specific team, it was a team of software architects, the Kanban implementation didn't go well. In fact, obviously, they started with visualization. And at that point, coaches that were helping them to introduce Kanban realized that it doesn't really work. So there was a huge resistance against visualization. People wouldn't be updating their status. So they started digging out why. And what they realized was that in that team, a team of software architects, visualization was a threat for a feeling of safety of those people. Why? Because they were basically accomplishing nothing. They were going to the meetings, they were having discussions about architecture, they were sounding wise, but they were accomplishing nothing. And visualization, and what we have behind visualization, transparency. That transparency was a threat to the feeling of safety of those people. And I don't say whether it's good or bad. I just say these two things are not aligned. And if we don't understand that, we will be surprised. Oh, we introduced that awesome tool and it doesn't work. Now, one more example from kind of a different area, Gemba Walk. Gemba Walk is this idea that is basically described in every single important book about lean you can find. It's there. And the idea is simple. You, as a manager, should go and see how the work gets done. Instead of sitting in your corner office, you should actually go and see the real work. Now, interestingly enough, the other day I went for a Gemba walk and this is what I've seen. I guess the work is getting done. I think. Now, again, the problem with our context, the context of knowledge work, is that work is not visible. We are not on a factory floor where we see piles and piles of parts, and we can say, oh, we have a queue here. We are not on a factory floor where a process is designed out by how machines are organized. We are working with those intangible things like beats, this magic dust. We don't see beats. So again, without understanding why a specific practice, specific technique was there in the first place, why it worked in the first place, and what is our context, just copying that practice is unlikely to help us. So let's look at our iceberg again. So what's beyond the practices? We have principles. So let's think what kind of principles we have behind our practices. So since Kanban is close to my heart, I decided to use Kanban as an example. So here are the practices from Kanban. There are 6 of them. But let me use visualization as an example. So a principle behind visualization would obviously be transparency. We want to know better what is happening in our team. Now, this is one part, understanding what kind of principles are behind a method. The other part would be understanding what kind of principles are embraced by the part of organization or the whole organization. So my question would be, if we want to use that tool, and one of the principles behind that tool is transparency, my question would be, how much transparency is embraced in an organization? And obviously there are a few different answers to the question, because we can say, oh, on a team level, we want to be transparent. We want to know what our colleagues do. But the question is, oh, but do we really want our manager to know what we are doing? And their manager? And our client? How far does transparency go? And oh, by the way, it's only a part of the process, because the real value stream starts far before what team does and finishes far beyond what team does. It starts where we have sales process. It ends up when we have maintenance. Do we have the transparency throughout the whole value stream? And oh, by the way, we have different levels of work. We have project level, we have portfolio level. Do our people know what is happening in other teams, in other projects? Do they know what other projects a company plans for them? And obviously, there is a completely different dimension, which is how the company is organized. Do we know that there is a reorganization pending? And oh, maybe our jobs are threatened. These are all questions about transparency. So if that transparency in our organization is very limited, I don't say don't go with Kanban. I just say that improvements that you would get from that method would be very, very limited or not sustainable. In fact, when we are talking about introducing Kanban, we are talking about introducing it across multiple teams. We are talking about going through multiple levels. We are talking about portfolio Kanban. I'm guilty of doing that, by the way. So the more limited transparency is, the more limited impact of introducing a specific method would be. A nice thing about Kanban is that, unlike many other methods, it has at least a few principles explained explicitly. And these are principles of Kanban. One of them is encouraging leadership on all levels. So it actually says what it is, encouraging leadership on all levels, across the whole board. So again, my question would be, oh, so how our organization, where we want to introduce that very tool, how our organization embraces leadership? So let me give you an example. This is an anonymous quote. It is a quote from my friend. And it's anonymous because it doesn't say good things about his organization. So my friend really likes to help teams change, help teams improve, and he would really love to do that. And in fact, he sees a lot of stuff that can be improved in his organization. Problem is that he has neither positional power nor autonomy to do that. So what does that say about embracing leadership in that organization? I mean, they do not embrace leadership. They have the rules, they have the hierarchy that is carved in stone, and you can go beyond that. So if the practice we want to use is not aligned with principles our organization embraces, the impact of that practice would be limited or non-existent or negative, as sometimes happens. Now, the lower part of this iceberg is values. So values is this intangible thing, but nevertheless something that organizations would be proud of. I mean, companies would say, oh, we care about customer satisfaction, we care about quality, we care about people, we care about fighting hunger in Africa, etc., etc., etc. Now, the interesting thing is, and something that is really, really important, is that what organization claims to be isn't necessarily what organization is. This is what I call authenticity gap. Stephen Parry says about it as a pretense. So we have a pretense that we want to deliver high quality stuff. The pretense doesn't really matter. What matters is how people every day behave. So anyone who works for an organization that doesn't claim that they care about high quality, like anyone? One person. You don't give a damn about high quality. Good for you. So this is a claim. This is a pretense. Now, what is reality? So how frequently in an organization that claims to care about high quality, you would see leaders, managers, or execs exercising specific behaviors like, oh, you cannot write unit tests because we have no time for that. And oh, by the way, TDD, bullshit, it's just wasting time. And per programming, like 2 people, 1 computer? No, that's not frigging possible. This is what that organization really is. And those situations defined whether they really do care about high quality. Let's take leadership. So what happens when people really want to exercise leadership whenever they feel that they're doing the right thing? I mean, typically organizations will claim that they care about leadership, they want to have more leaders. Now, I have a nice test for that. So I would go to different people in such organization, and I would ask them, you know, how much of an attitude defined by famous words by Grace Hopper, which is, it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to get permission. How much of that attitude is present across the board, throughout the whole organization? And what I would typically hear was like, oh, that's anarchy, we cannot do that. In fact, I was at least personally once fired because I believed that, and I acted like that. And it was too far. It was going too far for that organization. So I would ask that question, how much of that attitude is present in an organization? And frequently the answer would be not that much. Now the interesting thing is that the more of that attitude is present across the board, the less people actually need to ask for forgiveness. Pretty frequently, most situations when people really need to ask for forgiveness are where they forgot to ask permission in organizations that expect to be asked for permission. So again, this is this authenticity gap. One thing is a claim, one thing is pretense, which Stephen Parry stresses so much, and the other thing are behaviors, how we really act. And without understanding that, without understanding values, without understanding principles that emerge from those values, discussion about practices is pretty much irrelevant. So this is why this iceberg, this is why we should understand everything that is on that picture. And talking about that iceberg, in fact, there are two icebergs. Because one iceberg is for a method, for a tool. So we take a method, we take a tool, we take a practice, and we can figure out what principles were behind formulating that practice. What values people that did that in the first place believed in. Second thing is how our organization works. What values and what principles we care about. And if those two are not aligned, the applying of practice wouldn't work. So only if we understand the whole stack, we can learn. Because mindful use of practice will lead to learning. Understanding that will lead to learning. The problem is that mindless use of practice will lead to cargo cult. And as we know, cargo cults don't work. And this is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.